Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, hundreds of people evacuated the Alberton area as a massive chlorine cloud spread to the east. We now continue with Part 1, Chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7, Recon. Epigraph. Without protection, if you are downwind, you're in serious trouble. Gordon Hendrick. Daylight unveiled a dreary wet dawn. Zeigler and Fidler would try again with level A protection, but wore their suits at the ready, hoods off, with SCBA masks on the shoulder. Normally, they walked carefully into a site with gear deployed, but now faced a drive to an uncertain location and couldn't see well enough to drive with masks on. Yet, Fidler knew that chlorine is one of those chemicals you're sensitive to for a while, but then you become less sensitive to it, he said. You might not notice it as it becomes stronger. The plan was to find the wreck and observe from a distance while taking readings. Their monitor's intermittent beeping assured them it worked. The expensive device read oxygen and lower explosive levels, LEL, of flammable organics, with extra sensors for chlorine and carbon monoxide. A pump sucked in air to give real-time readings and time-weighted averages. They also carried pH papers for detecting acid moisture in the air or to use as a wipe. We were just reconning to take a look. No one knew where it was, Zeigler believed. Though Missoula Hazmat should have had the exact location by now from IC Walden or MRL, Zeigler said they were only told the spill was close to Alberton. Fidler added, "We didn't know what else we had, because when you start mixing chemicals, you come up with some really interesting things." As Fid monitored and worked the radio, his partner Ziggy drove while holding a camcorder to document. Later, he would go over the footage with Supervisor Jess Mickelson before a site entry. As the men left 9 Mile at 7:06 a.m., their monitor registered 0.1 parts per million of chlorine. Fidler had the window cracked as he took readings and wiped pH samples off their vehicle. The pH was normal. Zeigler's camera revealed the gray dawn through windshield and wipers as they drove I-90 at about 25 miles per hour. A steady drizzle fell. Several cars passed by headed east, late in evacuating. "I guess we're not having hazmat class today," Fidler joked. Zeigler's class was canceled, but the field trip was on. Pockets of fog drifted in the forested hillsides, or what looked like fog. Fidler's monitor peaked once at 0.2 parts per million. "We really didn't know what that was," Fidler recalled. "I think it was mostly just clouds. There was no way to test it, so we didn't know." As they neared Petty Creek, Fidler radioed Mickelson. "We're a couple miles from Alberton. We're still at 0.1%. Seems to be in pockets around here. Still nothing higher than 0.2%. Fidler had been incorrectly reading ppm as percent, so the readings here were 0.1 and 0.2 parts per million. Zeigler recalled, "We were still learning about monitors and the way you calibrated a monitor." In the bend of the river against Cinderella Mountain, across from Ponderosa Acres, hung a large white fog-like cloud, tapering into a thin necklace that wrapped around up the drainage of Petty Creek. But the highway was clear, and gas readings continued to be very low, at times 0. A few cars continued to zoom by, eastbound. "He's in a hurry," Zeigler said of one. As they passed the Petty Creek exit, lower patches of fog loomed ahead. They were 2 miles from the center of Alberton. The cloudy sky brightened. Every so often, Zeigler stopped recording, and the footage and narrative picked up further down the highway. In the distance beyond the town, a thick plume, perhaps a couple 100 feet high, arced across the canyon before dipping down again to the north. "It's on the other side of Alberton," Zeigler said, pointing west through the windshield. If this was it was big. "Back at 1% LEL, Fidler said. LEL levels this morning reached as high as 6%. Fidler didn't know what these levels meant, other than LEL was an indicator of organic flammable gas in the air. When Mickelson later talked to the makers of the device, they had no other explanation. Chlorine was not flammable. Unfortunately, Zeigler didn't film much to his right side to reveal Alberton. He even briefly shut the camera off as they passed by the town, turning it on again just as they passed the ramp for exit 75, the west end of Alberton. "How far past the Alberton exit is this wreck?" Fidler asked on the radio. "I'm hoping you can tell me," Mickelson responded. "We don't have very good data on where it's at." Clouds and fog pockets added to the confusion. The plume they'd seen earlier grew closer. That might be our cloud right there, John, Zeigler said. The top of the arc was no longer clearly defined. A plume strung out from the south, and to the north a dispersed haze settled against the mountains. Let's go up slowly, Fidler cautioned. Yes, slowly, Zeigler agreed. They spoke little. Fidler recalled, so you don't know what all is involved and whether you have another chemical that you actually can't smell or something in there that is really critical. Yet with their SCBAs at the ready, they risk surprise exposure. Zeigler slowed, looking for a spot in the median to cross to the eastbound lanes. I think we found our cloud, John. Mickelson broke in. I just got some feedback that says that there are 2 MRL personnel in Level A suits at the tank car site investigating. Jesus, Zeigler cried. We were under the impression that we were the first people going in there, Fidler recalled, laughing. MRL was already there. I just got additional information that they want to rendezvous with you guys, Mickelson added. Mickelson recalled this information was secondhand, perhaps through 911, and he hadn't heard yet directly from MRL. Apparently, I.C. Waldron was out of the loop as well, or not sharing. Fidler thought MRL could have given us some good feedback, he said. For instance, a bloody mile marker. Perhaps MRL had their own reasons for being first on site, but without communication, who knew what they were thinking? The haze spread across the highway to the north, from ground level to perhaps hundreds of feet high. The valley tacked northwest, so the visible gas cloud bordered just northwest of Alberton. Zeigler recalled the gas cloud appeared to rise about halfway up the mountains to the north, then drift toward Alberton. Did they evacuate everybody here, he wondered aloud? Zeigler found a place to cross over to the far south shoulder. Driving slowly, he panned the camera a little to the north to reveal a general haze obscuring the fold of West Mountain Creek drainage. Mickelson broke in. What we know we think is that the actual derail site is 6 miles west of Alberton near the Sear exit. 4 more miles. This is just fog then? Zeigler asked, confused. Whatever the source of this bad information, in fact, the site was 2 miles west of Alberton, and Zeigler and Fidler were almost at ground zero. They continued slowly, nearing the fog. Fidler noted 0.1 parts per million of chlorine. As they crept along the guardrail on the edge of the riverbank, Fidler said, "There's the end of the train," meaning the head cars left behind by the engines. 0.2, he updated. The nearest highway mile marker was 73, and they parked to observe. The time was 7:30 a.m. Only now, 3 hours and 23 minutes after the derailment, did Missoula Hazmat know exactly where the spill was. Privately, MRL had confirmed the rail mile marker at 5:10 a.m. I.C. Waldron should have known as well. At the riverbank, they had only the width of the Clark Fork, Reardon Lane, and a bit of bench land between them and the track, perhaps a block and a half, Zeigler recalled. About 600 feet. Despite their proximity to the spill, they didn't seem to be in the path of the plume. We were safe. We weren't even near it, Zeigler recalled. The air was calm, and any ongoing visible gas rose up and drifted above their position. It was coming across the river, going up, he said, and as it cooled, started sinking back down again to the interstate and started coming around behind Alberton. Fidler didn't notice a smell as he monitored, so they kept their SCBAs at the ready. Observing this close, Fidler recalled, it was a very dense, thick white cloud, and you knew it was not the fog, and there was fog around. Looking through the pines at the vapor-shrouded site, Fidler saw no indication that cars had gone into the river. Zeigler used his zoom lens to look closer. The plan was to determine what had derailed, what looked damaged, and what might have spilled. They quickly located a group of tanks swathed in a thick rising white vapor, rolled together like logs and obviously damaged. Zeigler knew that any tank with a single hatch on top was pressurized, like chlorine. He also noticed a black tank with 2 hatches. They reported that 4 chlorine cars and, quote, sodium had derailed, based on the manifest. The sodium referred to sodium hydroxide, a main component of potassium cresylate. Even with the manifest, responders relied on the placards on the side of rail cars to confirm identification, though placards might be impossible to see. MRL's Gordon Hendrick recalled a further danger. They can put anything in boxcars, as long as it's below a certain amount, he said. It doesn't have to be placarded. That's pretty scary. You never know what you're going to get into on a derailment. We were just trying to identify what we have to make sure that we don't have two cars that were going to combine and cause a third chemical or reaction problem, Zeigler recalled. His concern would prove prescient. The men speculated that chlorine leaked from the bottom of a tank car, judging from the rise of fumes and lack of a visible breach. That was a problem. The videotape ended. There was no sign of MRL personnel, and the Recon team would make no rendezvous. But they did note a cat in respiratory arrest at the site location. Ziggy and Fid never knew the fate of the unfortunate feline. The highest reported reading in mile marker 73 on the Recon was 0.4 parts per million. Parked across the river, they weren't directly downwind, Zeigler recalled. Who knows where the cloud goes, but we were not in it. Zeigler added that some gas also hugged the river, moving west downstream. Once away from the site, Missoula Hazmat reported a cloud was just to the northwest of the town of Alberton, and as they went through it, it got no higher than 4 parts per million. But Zeigler recalled, "We never did drive through the cloud. He didn't recall smelling anything, and we purposely rolled down the window, too." They definitely should have noticed up to 4 parts per million of chlorine. At 7:50 a.m., Missoula Hazmat noted the Recon team was returning, reporting, "The cloud is settling in the low areas. All readings were low on the monitor." Zeigler and Fidler arrived back at 9 Mile at 8:05 a.m. As Missoula Hazmat reviewed the video, they noted one car is on its side and one is leaking. It's assumed at this point the overturned car is the leaking car. Hazmat didn't know what else might have breached. Missoula Hazmat updated that Alberton is being evacuated, along with a 6-mile wide corridor along I-90 between Sear Bridge and the 9 Mile Hill. This was the first mention of evacuation as far west as Sear, though none of the logs reflected evacuations conducted west of the spill, except on Plateau Road. A Missoulian photographer took pictures from a helicopter at 8 a.m., soon after the Recon left the area. Zoomed in from above and somewhat east of the spill, the headline photo cropped out anything north of the spill. A small white gas cloud enveloped several tankers, expanding to a low, large cloud drifting up and back a couple hundred feet to the south. A separate photo revealed a close-up jumble of black and white tankers. In the April 12 Missoulian, the lead story read, "A dangerous white plume of chlorine gas floated over the site, shifting with the prevailing winds." 8 a.m. was likely the time that KPAX TV took their flight footage over the site. At one point, another helicopter came into view, and the scene in the video looked similar to news photos. A white vapor or gas concentrated over the tanks, with a thick plume rising up and back to the south, perhaps southeast. Nearby houses and ranch land on Plateau Road were enveloped in gas. No responders were visible. There was no clear view to reveal whether gas had drifted elsewhere, such as to the north as seen by Zeigler and Fidler half an hour earlier, or to the southeast toward Alberton. News media focused on the site. The scene that responders and the media found was the aftermath, much less active than earlier. University of Montana chemist Garen Smith later explained that constant venting was cooling the air and making some more mist. Smith speculated on why a gas cloud continued to rise high up from the site, despite the density of chlorine and the cool day. He wondered if there had been a heat source, such as a fire. If you have a heat source, he said, that's going to take a plume up. But reaction with moisture may have created heat, Smith thought. If you have water there, it converts it to HCl and HOCl and starts moving around. If there's any heat generated by the reaction, that could certainly cause a lifting of that plume. Another source of heat was a warming day, but at 8 a.m., with clouds, the temperature had barely begun to climb. The chlorine gas continued to surprise. Eyewitness accounts and sparse measurements showed that gas spread broadly east, upriver, along Bible Lane, through Alberton, past Petty Creek and Ponderosa Acres, up Roscoe Lane, and continued to spread east past Huson, perhaps into Frenchtown. Gas had also been reported north up the 9 Mile Valley and south up Petty Creek. Gas had also spread west as far as Fish Creek, likely riding the cool air mass above the river. Even as fresh gas continued to vent, older gas lingered in the area, and some gas held in pockets. 4 hours after the initial release, chlorine gas, subject to a complex environment, had probed all directions. After Zeigler and Fidler returned to forward ops at 9 Mile, Missoula Hazmat reviewed their video. At 8:16 a.m., Missoula Hazmat reported some of MRL's own recon findings, now shared. Quote, MRL crew, ruptured tank chlorine, sodium hydroxide. That was the potassium cresslate. MRL's initial survey also reported 2 visible plumes. Missoula Hazmat was now in contact with MRL, and everyone wanted to meet. Having already visited the site without telling anyone, MRL sought official access. MRL proposed setting up at the Natural Pier Bridge around 10 a.m. and sending in a team of employees. But there would be no more entry until after a briefing at Frenchtown Command. Zeigler, no one knew what everybody else was doing, and that's finally when we put a stop and said, we're going to have a meeting. Because MRL was doing their thing, Frenchtown was doing their thing, we were doing our thing, and no one talked. The 8:45 a.m. briefing at the command post was attended by I.C. Waldron, Dave Swanson of MRL, and Missoula Hazmat's Jess Mickelson. Swanson announced that, based on MRL's entry, 4 chlorine cars had derailed and one had a rupture on the tank bottom with a, quote, big hole, vapor cloud. There had been no close inspection of the car. There was no indication that the dome valves had been damaged. MRL also noted a second chlorine car possibly leaked. Swanson said MRL had called in hazmat response from Seattle, a team from Georgia Pacific, makers of the chlorine. IC noted, there is some caustic material. The rain will aggravate the situation. MRL noted this car had a hole in its side. The caustic was the potassium cresslate, a non-pressurized liquid, and MRL implied that some had spilled and could react with water. MRL had also observed that a hopper of granular sodium chlorate had tipped over. The rain caused concern. Once wetted and dried, sodium chlorate, an oxidizer, could spontaneously ignite in contact with combustible organic material. Mickelson reported there was still a vapor cloud above Alberton. The Hazmat Recon and the MRL entry confirmed a detached gas cloud above Alberton, a shifting ongoing plume from the wreck, and that at least one chlorine tank had spilled and some potassium cresslate and sodium chlorate as well. The status of other cars, including the butane and hydrochloric acid, was uncertain. MRL now agreed to a joint recon, Missoula Hazmat's first entry and MRL's second. Chapter 8. Expansion. Beyond the evacuation zone. By daybreak, I.C. Waldron didn't think it necessary to extend the evacuation zone. But complaints of chlorine exposure near Huson continued, with reports of chemical smells as far east as Frenchtown. Huson had some 200 residents and Frenchtown 1,700, with more people living north in drainages. Sergeant Dave Ball noted the odor in Frenchtown around 7 a.m. I went up in the area of the 9 Mile because we had reports of complaints of smelling chlorine, he said. As soon as I left that school, I started smelling the odor, and then it would go away and come back, and it was kind of like I was going through zones. Ball used a filter respirator, taking the mask off to sniff the air, having no monitor. He smelled chlorine in the lower 9 Mile as well as in 6 Mile drainages. I got the impression that this odor, basically the cloud, was moving in clumps of high concentration, he said, with gaps of good air or low odor in between. At 7:34 a.m., a Huson resident reported to 911, "We smell chlorine real bad at home here." Another resident complaint soon followed. The Emergency Operations Center informed 911 that areas east of 9 Mile were not being evacuated at this point. "What we're telling them is if they can smell the gas, they probably want to leave," they said. EOC effectively advised self-evacuation to those Huson residents that happened to call in, but no official order or advice had been issued to shelter in place or evacuate, a confusing approach in a day in which all evacuations had taken place after the arrival of the gas. Meanwhile, official evacuations wrapped up. Around 8 a.m., Deputy Hintz reported Ponderosa Acres evacuated. Even with 2 late helpers, this had taken over 2.5 hours, almost 4 hours, into the spill. At the same time, Deputy Van Wormer finished Southside Road, and Deputy Reed finished the belated evacuation near the mouth of 9 Mile, the furthest east of evacuations. Soon, Petty Creek Road south for an unspecified distance was also reported notified and evacuated. Hintz didn't recall any deputy having specific health complaints later that day. But I don't know, he said. Hintz felt fine until a few days later. I ended up with a bacterial infection and laid me up for about 2 weeks and took me a while to get back in shape, he said. I just lost energy and got down to the point where I couldn't move. I went into the hospital and got the antibiotics. Hintz said I attributed it to the chlorine spill, though he couldn't prove a connection. Among the deputies that had the worst exposures, Hintz, Van Wormer, Walrod, Reed, and Wilson, only Hintz would agree to an interview, perhaps reflecting a stoicism in the culture of sheriff's deputies. Around 10:30 a.m., Mineral County Sheriff Mickey O'Brien went to Mineral County Hospital. O'Brien was, quote, not feeling too well from his unprotected exposure. But beyond the evacuation zone, more calls came in. Between 8:30 and 9:30 a.m., residents reported chlorine smells as far east as Frenchtown. At 9:34 a.m., Deputy Reed reported to Ball that he was by the river across from 6 Mile, and my eyes are burning, he said. Ball, you might want to check with command and see if we shouldn't evacuate. If you're burning eyes, I'd say the levels are up. At 9:45 a.m., Missoula Rural Fire Department advised, Houston on the bottom needs to be evacuated, south of Interstate. Ball recalled, I knew of a lot of residences. I was worried about those. Evacuations east of 9 Mile could wait no longer. By 9:57 a.m., Waldron made the belated decision. Deputies were to use their discretion. Quote, if your eyes are burning and stuff, go ahead and start to move them, Waldron said. But these further evacuations would be called precautionary. The deputies planned on evacuating at the mouth of 6 Mile and up about 3/4 of a mile, as well as Houston at the exit. Ball thought the evacuations resulted both from complaints and monitoring. I think it was a combination, he said. You almost need a permanent monitor and then take an average to really do it right. You've got to weigh the complaints. Once in a while they're getting a good whiff because the wind changes. So it's probably not a good place to be. We were going on the physical attributes. If they're tearing, if they're coughing, tell them to get out. But there were no reports on monitoring in the Houston area, and none was conducted by deputies who had no monitors. Responder and resident complaints from the Houston area had been logged since 3.5 hours earlier, with Deputy Reed first suggesting further evacuations at 6:42 a.m., which Waldron declined. Some area residents thought they smelled gas as early as 5:30 a.m. People reported a range of symptoms. Waldron recalled, we made some precautionary evacuations along the river. Some residents to the east, he said, well, they could smell it, but based on everybody in Hazmat taking readings, they weren't at levels that anybody was at risk. Any such monitoring was undocumented. It wasn't clear how evacuating areas 3.5 hours after first reports of smells and symptoms was precautionary. The evacuation zone now stretched about 12 road miles from the spill site to Houston. 6 Mile Valley was the first drainage east of 9 Mile, 1 mile west of Houston. Scattered homes nestled in secluded pockets of hilly forest and meadows. John and Roxanne Zeimet and their 2 sons lived on a small ranchette about 2 miles up the valley, some 11 miles east of the spill. Frenchtown Rural Fire Station 3 lay just downhill to the south of them. Chief Waldron lived nearby. A truck driver, John was returning home from Missoula when he was stopped at the Houston exit roadblock around 6:30 a.m. I could smell it. I could feel it burning my eyes and my throat, he said. Notably, Zeimet said, the state patrol told me that he was supposed to be at the 9 Mile exit, but he called and requested to move back to the Houston exit because it was too strong for him. The officer requested to move even further back, but they wouldn't do it, he said. Zeimet retreated to the Y and called Roxanne, who was a severe asthmatic. The smell of chlorine was noticeable as the family self-evacuated to Missoula before 8 a.m. They later drove back to Frenchtown for information. Roxanne, it's funny because as you drop down the hill right into the Frenchtown Valley, it was all of a sudden the air was just gone. Maybe it's because I have asthma and have had asthma for years, but my older son Jake has asthma too. It was just really, really hard to breathe, just right there. With Houston now being evacuated as a precaution, the Zeimets were allowed back home to get their animals around 11 a.m. When Roxanne returned to the 6 Mile Valley, she said, you could smell the gas and you could see the haze out here from it. And it was like in pockets, Roxanne said. You could feel it in your eyes and your throat and your chest. She smelled more than chlorine. It had almost like a fertilizer smell mixed with it, or a pesticide smell. The chlorine was strong, but there was something else there, Roxanne said. We took the horses to the Missoula Fairgrounds, and by then I was having a lot of trouble breathing. My eyes were burning, my throat was burning. Earlier that day, she had stopped by an emergency room. They wanted to admit me then, but I told them I couldn't because I had my kids to take care of. They gave her some medication. No one advised decontamination. As a severe asthmatic, Zeimet was an argument for, at the very least, advised evacuation or shelter in place in areas of potential low concentration, well in advance. The Zeimets said that most people in their area, perhaps 80%, self-evacuated. Area neighbors of the Zeimets, the Lundell family lived a mile up the 6 Mile Valley in a small gulch. Dan Lundell was a work-at-home artist. His wife Joyce worked at Stone Container. Joyce left around 5:30 a.m. for the Frenchtown pulp mill. Outside, she thought, "Boy, something smells like bleach." "I got a good whiff of it," Joyce recalled. "I didn't think nothing of it." She later got the news at the mill about the spill. "I kept asking, so what about 6 Mile?" "Nope, 6 Mile's safe." Dan Lundell hadn't a clue what was headed his way. After working indoors a while, sometime after 10 or 11 a.m., Lundell said, "I went out to get some of my junk out of the garage. It smelled so bad. It smelled like Hylex or bleach. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't have the faintest idea what happened. But it smelled so bad while I was in the garage that I could hardly stand it. My eyes started to water right away. And I thought, geez, Christ, what's going on?" So I walked back in, got in the house, shut the door, and didn't think much more of it. But as Lundell hurried back and forth to the yard throughout that day, holding his breath as much as he could, the smell began to fill the house. He developed a strong headache, he said, and my eyes just completely watered. I couldn't see. His lungs burned and he struggled to breathe. I'll never forget that smell. It was so strong, it just burnt you right up inside. You couldn't hardly breathe. Here, too, geography influenced exposure. Houses were spread out in the 6 Mile Valley, and Lundell had a neighbor below him who noticed no smell. "It seemed like it settled in my little valley here," Lundell said. The Lundell's home sat about 600 feet above the river. "It was pretty strong in here," Joyce agreed. "So it's just like it blasted up this valley, and it just hung right on the tree line on the hill. It couldn't get nowhere, you know." Joyce checked on Dan in the afternoon, and he told her it's not quite as bad in the house. The precautionary evacuations down in Huson were rescinded that afternoon, but when Joyce came home that evening, "It got so strong we had the doors and windows closed," she said. "It got so strong in this house. I says, 'Dan, we cannot sleep here tonight.' I says, 'Christ, we'll probably never wake up in the morning.'" The Lundells left about 8:30 p.m., 16 hours after the derailment, and stayed 3 nights at a Missoula motel, which MRL paid for. No one ever notified them about evacuating, precautionary or otherwise. "I didn't know nothing," Dan said. "I was teed off, too, about that. If he had stayed home," he said, "I know I wouldn't have made it through those 3 nights." Charlotte Ringlob and family lived in Huson on the first bench above the Clark Fork River floodplain, about 11.5 road miles from the spill. When she awoke around 6:45, Ringlob recalled, "We smelled what we thought was chlorine, like a swimming pool, even with the windows closed." Soon after, a friend warned the family of the spill. "Before we ever got out of the house," she said, "our noses started bleeding, and my gums started bleeding, and our eyes were burning. Outside, the smell would just knock you over," she said. "It made our skin burn. Besides chlorine," she said, "there was something else, like one of those bug sprays, like Raid, you know, a pesticide smell." The Ringlobs self-evacuated. "All we knew was that the birds were flying east, so that's which way we were headed." Ringlob said her area of about 30 homes received the precautionary evacuation around 10:30 a.m. But most people had already left, she said, because their noses were bleeding and stuff. That night, the family took a motel room. The next day, Ringlob, her husband, and their 12-year-old daughter woke up feeling very sick and went to the ER. "My daughter and I were both treated with antibiotics and inhalers. She ended up with pneumonia," Ringlob said. Charlotte had burns in her throat, mouth, and eyes. No one advised decontamination. Tammy Weingarten family lived on a small hill just north of the Huson exit, about 12 miles from the spill. Around 5:30 a.m., she said, "My family and I woke up and I had a sore throat. We slept with our windows open, and I smelled bleach. Concerned about her 4 children, Weingart called the Emergency Operations Center hotline set up after 6:30 a.m. They told her, "You guys don't have it out there." And I said, "My throat is sore. I woke up with a sore throat. We have it out here, you know." Her family and neighbors decided to self-evacuate. A half-mile to the north lived Weingart's sister, Deborah Ishler, and family. Ishler said, around 8 in the morning you could smell it really strong. As soon as you walked outside you would cough and you would choke. She called the hotline to complain. The only thing they said to us was that if you could smell it, to be safe, get out. So we did. Without an official evacuation, they took time getting animals out. From the time I stepped outside I was coughing, she said, and I was choking, really bad headaches. Your sinuses and your lungs felt like they were just permeated with it. Her eyes became irritated. Ishler's son recalled, everybody was coughing and wheezing. Ishler never saw a visible gas cloud. Trudy Green's family lived about 2 miles up Hoole Creek, about 13 and a half road miles from the spill. Green first heard about the spill around 6 a.m. from a friend in Frenchtown. We opened up the door and it was like, Green illustrated with a gagging cough. The Greens received no official notification of the gas cloud that had already arrived. Green owned several llamas. I had to go down into the pasture and bring them up, she said. The gas immediately took my breath away, and I felt the burning in my nose, and I was having trouble breathing. Back inside, Green said, I immediately washed my face and rinsed my eyes, blew my nose, but it was evident right from the very start, particularly in my nose, that I had some damage done. It ended up being permanent. I actually had blisters in my nose and way up into my sinuses. Her lungs actually hurt to breathe, she said. Green said the smell was absolutely in the house. Her kids complained that their noses burned. They smelled only chlorine and saw no visible gas cloud. Among all the areas evacuated east of the spill, the exposures experienced by people east of 9 Mile were most obviously preventable. Yet, evacuation was not called for until around 10 a.m., and then only as a, quote, precaution in limited areas near Houston. Such residents were allowed to return late that afternoon. No earlier advisory for self-evacuation or shelter-in-place was issued. Waldron claimed, based on undocumented readings, well, they could smell it, but they weren't at levels that anybody was at risk. But beyond the evacuation zone, east of 9 Mile, residents and responders up to 14 road miles from the spill reported a range of symptoms, including burning and watering eyes, burning skin, sinus blisters, bleeding gums and nose, headache, burning lungs, sore throat, coughing, difficulty breathing, and the triggering of asthma attacks. Many people had complained to 911, EOC, and responders. To the south, complaints came from other areas not evacuated. Around 7 a.m., Judy Castillo of the West Fork of Petty Creek reported to EOC a sweet chemical smell, getting stronger. Castillo and her husband self-evacuated after 8 a.m., reporting burning eyes, nausea, and vomiting. At 8:53 a.m., Sergeant Ball reported, I've had a number of calls from the West Fork. They are advising that their noses and eyes are watering, running, and they are saying they must get out. Residents had to go south into the mud trap at Graves Creek Pass or north into the gas cloud. People at Petty Creek were essentially trapped for self-evacuation. The West Fork ran northwest back towards the spill, and Ball speculated that gas came over the mountains into the drainage. News media showed a plume rising high up from the site and drifting south at 8 a.m. Residents of the West Fork said yes, the gas had arrived. I.C. Waldron issued no evacuation order or advisory for the West Fork of Petty Creek. Pam Roberts and family lived 8.5 miles up Petty Creek. A Frenchtown volunteer firefighter, Roberts missed the first call. She smelled nothing at her house. Her volunteer partner, Mitch Hicks, who lived a mile north of her, staffed a roadblock up Petty Creek after his initial response. Around 10 or 11 a.m., Roberts visited Hicks, along with his wife, Kay. About a half-mile north of the West Fork intersection, Roberts said. All of a sudden we smelled something. We went, oh my, that must be what chlorine smells like. But, Roberts recalled, it didn't smell like bleach, it had a different smell. Hicks' roadblock was 2.5 miles up Petty Creek. He didn't know because he had already been there and had been smelling it for so long That he didn't really know that the cloud of chlorine or whatever was there, Roberts said. Hicks had been there half an hour, but his desensitization to the smell also came from his earlier response. Olfactory fatigue and numbness to some effects masked an enemy that fooled you it wasn't there. But physical damage worsened. Roberts, his wife told him, "Get out of here, you're in the cloud, you shouldn't be in here." And that's when they moved the roadblock up south to the West Fork, she said. Once again, the movement of the cloud had been unanticipated and unmonitored, and adjustments came after the fact. Hicks recalled the gas was very irritating. "Did I have to get out of there?" "No," he said. Hicks may not have felt driven to leave, but admitted he was hoarse, his eyes watered strongly, and his sinuses were irritated. "Typical strong chlorine smell," he said. "It's strong, but I didn't have any respiratory issues," he reasoned. Waldron ordered Hicks to the hospital later in the day. "I was so hoarse I could hardly talk," he said. Waldron told him, "You've been exposed to a high dose of chlorine." I said, "Yeah, evidently. They wanted to life flight me." But Hicks took an ambulance. After encountering Hicks, Roberts advised residents on the West Fork that they may evacuate soon. "Even there," she said, "a couple of times we got a little whiff of it, but it wasn't really strong." She then staffed a roadblock at the West Fork of Petty Creek intersection. She had no protective gear and no chlorine monitor. That day and the next, Roberts felt tired. "I didn't think anything of it. Little light flu symptoms, feeling tired and run down." There were no evacuations for the West Fork, precautionary or otherwise, despite Sergeant Ball reporting residents with symptoms, quote, saying they must get out. Including the ambulance report at Fish Creek, the gas had expanded beyond the official evacuation zone in all directions, regardless of wind, gravity, mountains, and expectations. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, the Missoula Hazmat team of Zeigler and Fidler finally entered the spill site, along with a team from MRL who have already been there. Meanwhile, the gas still drifts, causing more late evacuations. Till then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.